Hi everyone, it's Karen here and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a brand new tutorial where I created an altered box using some mixed media products and stamp and dies from Spellbinders. Spellbinders was kind enough to send me a new Platinum 6 machine and the Cool Vibes stamp and die set, which has two beautiful feathers that I used in my project. Although most people use Spellbinders to create cards or for paper crafting, I wanted to show that you can use Spellbinders products to create mixed media projects or altered projects. In this case, I grabbed a circular cardboard box and I altered it. The first thing I did is cover the box in white gesso. I took Prima heavy white gesso and covered the whole box. This is a perfect gesso for that because it's so thick that you only have to give it about 1 or 2 coats and it covers the box perfectly. I only gave this box 1 coat of the gesso in this case, only because I knew I was going to add more mediums and I knew that it would cover the box eventually. All the products are listed below in the description area. I let the gesso air dry while I went ahead and die cut some of the pieces to embellish the box. I wanted to create a texture on the box and I took a couple of Nestabilities Spellbinder dies. These are old dies that I bought long time ago, but you can use any type of die for this effect and you will see what I mean. All I did is cut out a few pieces of the same shape in different sizes, as these are dies that nest within each other so they fit perfectly and they can create that really nice 3D effect. Spellbinders has lots of Nestabilities dies, and I just used one that looks like a doily, so any one that looks round or has a doily is perfect for this. So I just went ahead and took a paper that was a little bit thicker, almost like cardstock or like blotter board, which is what they make coasters with. And I went ahead and cut out some of these dies and created some blossoms, which is what this die is called, but it could also be used some circular die or any type of mandala die or even a doily. This paper is a little bit thicker, almost like chipboard, and it actually ran through the machine beautifully. I was really impressed of how easily I could run this thick paper through the machine, and I ran it twice even though I only needed to run it 1 time. So I first cut a few of the doilies, but when I went back and did it a second time, I only ran it through 1 time and it cut it beautifully. I cut different sizes of this doily so I could add it to my box, and I'm listing below some other Nestability dies that are current right now so you could create the same effect. To create the feathers, I took the Cool Vibes Spellbinders stamp and die set. This is a current one that is out in the market, and I took my Tim Holtz stamp platform and went ahead and stamped it with VersaFine black ink because I wanted to emboss it. I could have also used the Versamark ink and used black embossing powder because I had actually used black embossing powder, so it didn't really matter what ink I was stamping with. I stamped this 5 times using the black ink, and then because this is a pigment ink, it stays wet longer, so all I had to do is just add the embossing powder on top. And I used super fine embossing powder by Ranger. I used thick white cardstock to stamp the feathers because I wanted it to be thick enough that it can withstand the mixed media sprays that I was going to put on top of the feathers. It is not as thick as the other cardboard paper that I use for the doilies, but it's thick enough that it can withstand the mixed media. Once I finished stamping all 5 feathers, I added the black embossing powder on top of all of them, and then I heat set it. Then I took my platinum machine again and went ahead and lined up the feathers using microspore tape to hold the die to the paper and make sure that it's lined up perfectly. I cut up all 5 feathers so I could use for my project. The microspore tape is perfect to hold dies onto any paper because when you run the die through and then remove the tape, it doesn't rip the paper. So it's the perfect consistency to keep the die in place. You can use the same piece of tape and move the die from one feather to the next until you finish cutting all of them. And I didn't even have to use another piece of tape. I just lined it up again and it stuck perfectly. So I went ahead and cut all 5 feathers. Since the feathers were made out of paper, I wanted to make sure that they are protected from the mixed media products. Although the paper is thick enough to withstand it, I still wanted to protect the surface. So I went ahead and covered them in clear gesso. All I did is add a coat of clear gesso both to the front and to the back of the feathers. That way, when I added the sprays, it wouldn't make the paper very thin. It wouldn't water down the paper or make it dissolve. And the clear gesso helps protect the paper from any type of spray or mixed media product. And the nice thing about it is that it stays clear so you can actually see the stamped image and the color. To add texture to the lid of the box and also to the sides of the box, I went ahead and took the doilies that I had cut. The reason why I cut them so thick with such a thick paper is because I wanted to make sure that I get that really nice thick texture when I apply them. I use Prima soft matte gel medium to glue these doilies, and I cut some of them so they would fit around the box. I layered some of the doilies so they would nest within each other. That's why I wanted those nestabilities from Spellbinders, because they look really well nested together. And all I did is glue them one inside the other. I use my silicone brush to apply this soft gel because it's just one of the easiest things to use. And I use different size doilies to glue to the surface. Once I added enough doilies to the top, I made sure that the gel and the paper are really dry because I wanted to cut the edges around the lid. So all I did is just grab my scissors and cut around the edges. They weren't fully dry, which was a little bit of a problem, but I managed to do it anyways and just held it together and then lined them up again. Then I let them dry while I was working on the box itself. For the sides of the box, I went ahead and did the same thing. I cut some of the shapes in half and then started bending them to make sure that they fit around the roundness of the box. I glued as many as I could and layered some of them as well until I was happy with the way they looked. I used the same soft matte gel to glue them to the surface, and I had to sometimes use some clips to hold them, especially with the larger pieces. I nested them one within the other the same way I had done with the lid because this added a 3D texture to the surface. As you can see, I'm using some clips to hold all the doilies together because I want to make sure they glue to the surface. Once they were fully dry and I heat set this for a long time, I went ahead and wanted to add more texture. To do this, I took the Prima paper texture paste and using a palette knife, added texture both on the lid and on the sides of the box. One of the tricks that I found useful is to use the paper texture to hide some of the imperfections at the edges of the box. So it would hide the areas where I maybe cut it the wrong way while I was trimming the doilies. But it also helped to create a really nice texture. And the reason why I wanted that really nice rough texture is because I knew I was going to add spray. And spray goes really nicely when there's a lot of texture on the background. And you will see what I mean in a few minutes. So I just added this paper texture randomly. I didn't even think where I was adding it. I just wanted to add some texture on some areas on the box and on the lid. And that added this really nice roughness to the background and it made it look more mixed media, which is the style that I like. Then I heat set this really well so I could add the embellishments. I went ahead and picked some Prima marketing flowers. These are some old flowers from mismatched packages, and I didn't really care because I knew I was going to color them in. The only thing I cared about is that I wanted to make sure that they're strong enough that they can be covered in gesso and they can withstand the sprays. So I took some of the tougher flowers, the stronger flowers that were made with a thicker paper, and those were really good when I added the gesso and the spray. Then I took some heavy gel and I just glued them to the background. I also grabbed a metal butterfly that I had in my stash, but any metal butterfly would work for this, and I just glued it on top of the flowers. I also grabbed some of these metal branches that I had in my stash. I've used this before on other projects and I really love them because they create beautiful texture. And all I did is just stick them in between the flowers and around the lid to just add that beautiful texture. I used again the heavy gel to glue them to the background, but I only used the gel in the inside part of the branch until it was glued perfectly. And you do have to dry this really well, otherwise they move when you add the other mixed media products. I also forgot to mention that while I was letting the paper paste dry before, I went ahead and used the white gesso to cover the inside of the box and the inside of the lid because I wanted it to be white everywhere. As you may have noticed, I still haven't added the feathers that I had originally stamped and cut. The reason why I haven't added these is because I'm only adding the elements that I want covered in gesso. I don't want to cover the feathers in the white gesso because I want to make sure that the stamped design from the feathers stays intact. So I'm adding these after I add all the white gesso, but before I do the spraying. I took my heavy gesso again. This is the heavy white gesso from Prima Finnabair, and I started adding my first coat of the gesso. I added the first coat to everything, to the butterfly, to the flowers, to the branches, and to the whole lid itself. I wanted to make sure that the embellishments are well covered and especially well protected, so when I add the spray, it doesn't harm the embellishments. Sometimes when you don't protect flowers, especially because they're made out of paper, when you start adding the sprays or any watercolors, they make the paper very thin and the flower doesn't look as nice. So it's really important to protect all these embellishments and add gesso in every single nook and cranny of every embellishment, especially the flowers. You literally need to lift the petals and add the gesso in between each petal. That way it's protected when you're spraying. Some of my embellishments were still a little bit loose, but once I'm done adding the gesso, I let this dry for a while, and that's when everything dries perfectly. I think I added about 2 or 3 coats of the gesso, but I heat set them in between. So you will know when you have enough. When you see that everything is covered and you don't have any pieces of embellishment colors showing through, then you know you've added enough gesso. So I continue doing it. I also had to turn the lid upside down to paint the metals on the other side as well. And a good technique to do is to hold your heat tool on one hand and then continue adding the gesso with the other hand. That helps to dry the gesso as you're applying it, and it's a quicker way of adding and drying the gesso. Now that the gesso was fully dry, it was time to add the feathers that I had wanted to add before. And this was the perfect time to add them because I knew that I didn't want them to be covered in gesso like I had told you before. So this helped to keep them intact and to have that really nice design to stay in place. And I took some of the soft gel this time to glue the feathers. And this was perfect. As you saw, I had already protected the feathers with the clear gesso, so there was not much I had to do. To make sure that the feathers fit perfectly underneath the embellishments, I had to cut the inside part of the feather. That way, it fitted perfectly. Since most of the embellishments were already dry, it was hard to fit the feathers in between them. So cutting them helped to make sure that they look as if they belong to the whole composition. I made sure that the gel that was sticking the feathers was fully dry before I started adding the spray. So I heat set everything really well again. Once it was all dry, I started applying the sprays. I started with the soft teal and just added it everywhere. But truthfully, you can skip this step if you want to, because you can barely see the soft teal once you add the stronger colors. So I started with the Prima Color Bloom Soft Teal. I heat set it a little bit, and then I went ahead with the deep teal. And this one brought a little bit more of that darker color to the background. However, I continued adding more colors until I was happy with the way they looked. And as you can see with the feathers, because it has that clear gesso, they actually don't get ruined, even though they're made out of paper. Same thing with the flowers. This is why it's so important that when you're working with mixed media, especially when it's something really fragile like paper, you want to make sure that you cover them in either white gesso or clear gesso, depending on the usage, and that way you're protecting them from the sprays. One of my favorite colors from the Color Bloom sprays is the fir needles. And this one is a deep green that almost looks like teal. And I went ahead and added it in between the embellishment, especially underneath the embellishments, to create a dark shadow underneath them. I did the same thing that I had done with the gesso, where I was holding the heat tool on one hand and then spraying with the other. This way, it just dries faster, which is very good for my impatient self. So I went and also added some brimstone wings, which is one of my favorite colors. It's a little bit of a shiny lime green. And I continued spraying the teal and the fir needles and mixing them all together until I was happy with the way they were looking. One of the neat tricks that I find that is really helpful, especially with this box, is to have the lid already on. So when you're spraying all the colors, you can let them drip on the sides, and you don't even need to spray the sides of the box. Anything that drips creates a beautiful finish to the sides of the box. And because you already have that really nice texture on the sides, just from the paper paste and also from the doilies, it made perfect sense that you can just let it drip on the sides, and that created a beautiful finish to the edges of the box. I also added some magic stone, which is a blackish gold color, but instead of spraying it, I took a thin paintbrush and I opened the lid and I added some of the darker color in between the embellishments using the paintbrush. I dipped the paintbrush inside the container, and then I just added it to the background underneath the embellishments. Then I heat set this color as well. I still felt like I needed more color to the background. However, I heat set it first before I added the second layer of colors. Finally, I also added the Color Bloom Spray Dragonfly Blue, and that one mixed really well with the fir needles and the brimstone wings as well. Then I heat set all the colors before adding the next step. Once everything was heat set, I took the white gesso again, and using a dry brush technique, I highlighted all the embellishments with white. This really brought everything together because it helped bring highlights to all the embellishments, and it made it all look so beautiful. The deep colors underneath the embellishments are the shadows, while the white gesso creates that really nice light on top of the embellishments, and it ties it all in. You might need to add a couple of these white gesso layers until you're happy with the way it looks. Thank you so much for watching. If you like my video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends on social media. I hope you liked watching just as much as I liked creating this project, and I hope it inspires you to create your own mixed media altered box. For more inspiration, subscribe to my channel and visit me on my website. Thank you so much. Bye!